All right, welcome to another episode of the Chaplin Performance Podcast. Again, I'll probably release this on YouTube and who knows where else. But today's topic here is going to be practical tips for managing asymmetry in training. So if you are someone who's got asymmetries and you're in training or trying to train, then this video is for you. Now, before we get into the tips, which are going to come in no particular order, I do want to say that we should understand why we should even care about this, right? Asymmetries are pretty normal. We all got them, right? With that being said, if asymmetries go off the rails, there is a chance that that might have something to do with how we're moving, right? How we feel moving in our body, and even things like pain experience, right? Right now, if we look in the literature, there's not a lot of great evidence that seems to suggest a one-to-one link, but if we kind of think mechanistically about this, if we're limiting our range of movement options to move very asymmetrically, and we get increased tissue stress on very specific areas because of reduced options elsewhere, that could translate to an increased probability of pain. So if you're listening to this and you go, yeah, I had this injury and it limited my movement in such and such a way, and now it feels like there's this area that always kind of gets beat up that didn't used to get beat up, then chances are this might apply to you, right? Maybe in 10, 20 years, there's going to be a bunch of research that comes out and is going to indicate that, well, we're actually on the money when it comes to looking at asymmetry, and we should care about this stuff, right? So it's kind of common sense, and I think if this resonates with you, then this is probably going to be a great episode. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in no particular order to these 7 tips. Tip number 1 is to video your lifts, and the reason we're videoing the lifts is so you can identify patterns, right? So if you have been somebody who's been trying to identify your particular pattern, whether that's from a postural perspective or from a movement perspective, one of the things that you might be running into is that you might have used like functional tests, like a toe touch, a straight leg raise, those kind of things, or more range of motion tests like knee to chest, hip, external and internal rotation. And don't get me wrong, I use all those tests. But what I found for myself when working with my own asymmetry is that I could improve performance on these tests either just by doing the tests or by doing specific exercises that I knew correlated to improvements in these tests. But then I didn't feel like I was actually moving much differently. And I went to then video myself in different contexts of lifting and moving, running, those kind of things, and then noticed that a lot of these asymmetrical patterns were still present. And so a lot of times we need to take a step back, understand from a program design perspective what we need to do to start to make sure we can get even motion on both sides of the body, some exposures that allow us to work right and left sides of the body, and then start to identify patterns. Because as we train in a well-rounded program, a lot of times, a lot of those asymmetrical strategies go away on their own as a result of who knows what, right? Could be an increase in endurance and strength in the underlying qualities that help us tolerate the stress that the asymmetries are trying to help us meet in the first place. Or it could just be that we're getting increased proprioception and the feeling of where we are in space, and that helps us improve these asymmetries over time. But there are going to be certain asymmetries that are a bit more stubborn. And if it's a pattern that you're seeing across a bunch of contexts, a bunch of different movements have the same exact strategy, chances are that is not noise, that is actually signal. And when you know what's signal and what's noise, because you've kind of had all the stuff that was going to get better on its own, already get better on its own, and you've got all this video evidence of all the other stuff that you've been doing, and you can see these clear patterns, then you know that, okay, I might need to dive in and look at that on a more isolated level. So that is tip number 1. It is so easy to video your lifts. In terms of some practical advice here on actually videoing them, I would say that you want to start out and get views from the side. So if you can see your body's alignment from the side view, that's going to help you visualize the movement of your body in the sagittal plane. You'll see the relationship between head, rib cage, and pelvis there, as well as weight distribution over your feet. Then to get a feel for left and right, once that looks good, then you want to go from the back or the front. And that should allow you to see rotation as well as left to right. In terms of which lifts to video, you don't need to video every single lift, but definitely video maybe like the first set and then a couple of sets as you work up into your heavier weights. If you're doing something like sprints, just a couple of the sprints, and then understanding what does a fresh sprint look like, what does a fatigue sprint look like, get a number of angles there, and just be consistent. So if you pick a couple of exercises to video in week 1, try to video those every single week, or at least in the first and last week of a training block. So There's probably more to say there, but let's move it on. Number 2, this is more of a program design consideration, and that is to select a combination of unilateral and bilateral exercises. So in layman's terms, exercises that work a single limb at once and exercises that work both limbs in the same way at the same time. So if we think about single limb exercises, they're going to expose any major differences between the two sides of the body. And what we're looking for here is to be able to use mirror strategies on either side. So let's say I go do a split squat on the left and my left shoulder kind of drops down a little bit more on that side. We want to see a mirror on the right. So when we're on the right, we want to see the right drop down. If we start to see that the pelvis moves a little bit differently or the rib cage moves a little bit differently as we're over that side, or the knee caves in and out differently, then that's something that we can key in on and say, okay, what looks more normal? So which one do we want to change, right? And then we can have all sorts of strategies to work with that, but it all starts with just making sure we have the opportunity to get exposures to loading each of those sides individually. Now, bilateral exercises are ones where we're not fully shifted over the left leg, not fully shifted over the right leg, but we're standing on both legs and they're doing the same thing at the same time. If we have a difference in the contribution there, you're going to see some wonky stuff like some sort of a hip shift, or one knee kind of comes in when the other goes out. And again, we want to kind of assess which of these is normal, and then how can we either change the exercise or the cues to be able to make this look a little bit better. Now, we'll get into a little bit more nuance on that as we go, but from a big picture perspective, some symmetrical stuff to practice being symmetrical in that context, and then some stuff that is asymmetrical to really isolate the left and right sides. All right, moving on. Number 3, include multiple planes of motion. So if we think about most of the movement that the majority of us are going to do on a day-to-day basis, and the majority of the movements that we're going to do in the gym, they tend to occur front to back in what's known as the sagittal plane. So if we're moving all the time in the sagittal plane, we don't get as much of an opportunity to expose differences between the left and the right, or to really make any meaningful progress with these differences left to right. So we want to understand that we do need to program exercises that move us side to side. That's going to give us a good idea of frontal plane movement, left to right. Can we shift laterally to the left, laterally to the right? And then also rotational movement, right? Can we rotate over the left side, rotate over the right side, rotate off of the right side, rotate off of the left side? If we can include all those 3 planes and then understand how to work on developing competence in each of those planes of motion as we go, then we're going to, over time, have a very clear idea about what our biases are, right? We can go into that in more detail, but I think that probably does it for now in terms of just some specific examples here. Instead of just using a squat, you might do something like a lateral lunge, or you might do something like a staggered squat or a staggered deadlift, and then hold an implement in the opposite side from the foot that you're working and rotate towards that side and out of it. Or you might include some rotational med ball work. Anything that really gets you rotating, could be cable rotations, could be cross crunches, whatever it is, these are going to expose differences between left and right and give you a whole lot of data. Remember, every single test or exercise rather, in your program can be a test, right? So we don't need to rely on range of motion tests and those kind of things to determine how we're moving. In fact, we get a better awareness of how we're moving over time by selecting exercises that align with our goals, making sure we have a good mix of unilateral, bilateral, as well as multiple planes of motion, and then getting that real tangible awareness of how we're moving in our own body. That's what ends up building those skills that allows us to apply it across contexts without needing someone else to tell us what we need to do. Okay, number 4. This is a really big one, and this is to not overlook other areas of the body or old injuries, and those kind of tie in. So what I mean by this is we may be looking at what the pelvis is doing or what the rib cage is doing, but we might have an old injury up in the neck, and we know that all the regions of the body function together, but we might overlook something like that old injury in the neck, and instead we're focused on trying to make progress in the pelvis and the rib cage, but the pelvis and the rib cage might just be compensating and making it easier for that neck to function at its level of competence, at its level of strength, endurance, etc. Instead, we might have to go back and do direct neck work in this example to be able to bring the strength and endurance and function of that region up to par, which then unlocks the ability of the body neurologically to get into some of those positions that we were going after. So really common ones here include sort of like the other stuff, right? So when we think about wrist and hand, foot and ankle, as well as neck, those are three of the regions that oftentimes, if we have an old injury in and we don't rehab properly, can certainly affect the way that we're moving with respect to whatever region is involved. So if it's lower body, it's going to be a lot of standing stuff. If it's neck, it's going to be a lot of your standing and walking and balancing type stuff. If it's hand and wrist, it's going to be more of the upper body stuff, especially closed chain stuff like planks and push-ups. So don't overlook old body parts or old injuries. And if you need to catch them up, put exercises in that work directly on range of motion, strength, endurance, etc. of those areas. Oftentimes that will unlock other things that you're working on. All right. Number 5 is to identify load and volume trends with respect to the expression of asymmetry. So what we mean here is that asymmetry is really just a strategy to deal with stress. And so the amount of weight that we're using, either in terms of volume, so how much added up over the course of a microcycle or a macrocycle, right, weeks to months, or the actual load on that specific exercise, the amount of weight we're lifting, those are forms of stress. And we need to meet those demands of stress. And one of the ways that we can do that is by expressing these asymmetrical strategies. Now, if we get to a certain amount of weight that day or a certain amount of overall work performed within a certain time frame, like a week or a 4-week block, then what we might find is that there is a threshold at which we start to rely more and more on that asymmetrical strategy. And if we kind of lean into that, then we might actually start experiencing some movement limitations over time in that particular training block. And we want to just identify this. We can, as we'll talk about in a little bit, make adult decisions about if we want to allow this or to what extent we want to allow this or how we want to balance this. But if your primary goal is to improve movement quality, then you probably mainly want to stay below these thresholds of load and volume with respect to the expression of asymmetry, and instead understand how you might be able to load the body and how you might be able to distribute the overall training stress such that we minimize the expression of asymmetry and are able to maximize the expression of these newer strategies that help us to manage this asymmetry. All right, there's lots of strategies with that. One of my favorites here is going to be to use different intensities on different days. So let's say in a week, on Monday, we could do higher intensity work where it's low repetitions, high intensity. And then on a Wednesday, we could do lower intensity work that tends to get the aerobic system going. So more like a circuit style of training with a relatively low heart rate and low effort. That's going to allow us to just kind of flow and dissipate some fatigue. And then on a Friday, we could do more of a moderate intensity lift, which is like your traditional bodybuilding style, sort of sets of 8 to 15 to 20 reps even of, pretty hard but not super intense lifting. And if we distribute different intensities and then the volumes that go with that across the week, a lot of times that helps us to manage staying below those thresholds where asymmetry is increased, or to kind of focus those on specific days. So maybe on the high intensity day or the moderate intensity day, you express that asymmetry a bit more, but on that middle low intensity day, you have an opportunity to kind of work out of that a little bit, and that balances that cycle. All right, moving on here. Number 6, choose constraints that allow for access to limited motion. So what do we mean by this? So a constraint is anything that makes you get into a certain movement or increases the probability that you're going to get into a certain movement without you having to apply an internal cue. So an internal cue is something like where you're feeling it in your body. A constraint is something like changing where you place the load, putting a box behind you, choosing a machine versus a free weight. all these things help you to get into a situation where you don't have to think as hard, but you increase the probability of getting into the position you want just through the exercise selection alone. And then a way that you can progress over time is as you're developing skills by using those constraints and developing underlying qualities, you can then choose to remove those constraints or change them as you progress through your program. So some of the constraints that I really like here when it comes to asymmetry would be something like heel elevation. It's going to allow you to shift back a little bit more in space, kind of squat a little bit more straight up and down on your squats, be able to access a little bit more of the early stance phase of gait associated mechanics and a little bit more expansion on the backside of the body. I like anterior loads when dealing with asymmetry, again, for the same reason. I love machine-based training. I also love putting a bench or a box behind you and working within your available range of motion on something like a squat. So instead of just trying to go ass to grass just because it's air quotes better, just select the height at which you can move without maybe doing a hip shift. Then you have a nice target to shoot for. You can touch your hips to the actual box and then get used to what it feels like to come down evenly. Then you can kind of come up from there. And once that's patterned, then you can remove that over time. Okay, and last but not least here, and I think this is an interesting one and a fun one to kind of end on, and we're going to bring around this concept of adult decision making, which is decide how much asymmetry you want. So the reality is that all of us are asymmetrical. We are not trying to get into a situation where we don't have any asymmetry in our training. We actually want to decide how much asymmetry we want. So for example, maybe from point number 5, we identified a certain load threshold at which the expression of asymmetry is increased. So we're doing a deadlift, we get up to 315 pounds, no asymmetry. We get up to 335 pounds. Now all of a sudden we're starting to kind of pull over towards the left side a little bit, unload the right side. We have an increase in asymmetry. If we're doing the majority of our reps below that loading threshold and the overall volume, so the kind of total amount of weight lifted for a particular load, is just like 10% of the overall program, and the rest of it, 90%, is done at a load where we don't have that asymmetry, then it's probably fine. It's a 90-10 split. We go, the trade-off that I get by going a little heavier here and having a bit more asymmetry is worth it, because I'm going to get stronger underlying qualities that are ultimately going to help me manage stress are going to be developed. And that's actually going to reduce the probability of the expression of asymmetry over the long term, even though here in the short term for these reps, I'm using a little bit more of an asymmetrical strategy. Now, on the flip side, we could run into a situation where, oh yeah, I'm doing 60% of my reps with asymmetry and 40% with less asymmetry. How can I change the factors here to bias that a little bit less? So it might be selecting more unilateral exercises, reducing the load a little bit, distributing the energy systems on different days, increasing your recovery a little bit, managing emotional and lifestyle stress. So there's a lot of ways to go about that, but ultimately you want to decide how much asymmetry you want to allow in the program, not if. Okay, so I think that pretty much does it. I think the big picture here is that if we can reframe trying to avoid asymmetry to trying to manage asymmetry in training and understand that the training we do and the qualities that are developed through that training are actually going to help on the long term to decrease and manage those asymmetries, then we can strike that perfect balance between hard training and looking at the movement. If we look exclusively at the movement and we don't train, then we're going to run into a potential not so great situation. And on the flip side, if we're just training super hard and we're not paying attention to how we're moving at all, then we can also run into trouble there. So with these practical tips, hopefully you can strike that balance. If you have any questions, you can find me on my socials, hit me up, leave me a comment, shoot me a message. And if you want to dive deeper, join the waitlist for my group coaching program, Total Body Restoration, where I cover these in more depth. So as always, thanks for listening. Until next time, peace.